Right, well, we're going to go on to questions now, and we've got the first batch of questions coming in. I've got Nancy Jean of Lifespan in the United States, who's asking a very simple question. Maybe I could put this to Leslie as to what are the best monitoring tools out there in the market. We hear a lot of different offers of tools out there. Should we be using tools, and what are the best ones?
Absolutely. I think companies should be using different tools, monitoring tools, whether it's monitoring what's in the traditional media like we've always done, or really looking at social media. And it's just like everything else, there's so many every day. There's a better mousetrap, a better way to monitor. The best monitoring tool are people in your organization, people who understand the context of something that comes up, who might see it as a real issue. So I think relying on your team, people within the organization, to really understand what's behind it is critical.
And we've got, I think, Nick, we hear brand names like Radian 6 and so on. I mean, are they helpful devices?
Yeah, I think they all are. There's a range of tools, and probably we'd help clients build more of a dashboard, because they're starting to all do different things. We're not just saying how big's the conversation, we're saying how influential is the conversation, how much, there are tools that let you link blog posts back to specific media articles. So is a particular, columnist very, very important in activating that. So, what's actually opening up is the range of what it can do to understand that world.
Oh, you've got a question for you now coming in, Rod, from Marika Korneff of Sanofi Aventis in the Netherlands. Who's saying what is online stays there. How do we decide on what to react to and what not to react to? How do we tackle material that's embedded in the digital space, and how do we decide to leave it alone?
That's a complicated question. There are some things out there that may not be noticed but could be extremely sensitive and may need to be managed. There is, of course, always the capacity to have things removed from the internet. That is obviously not something you choose to do lightly, but sometimes that is an important thing to do. I think some of this comes back, frankly, to the monitoring question again, and I did just want to add a couple of things. One is, I think, companies need to look in many languages, not just English, and that is tough. The other thing is they need to talk to each other. A lot of things, they may be online, you may not notice them. You could, for example, have a disgruntled customer or employee. You may not notice this, but maybe the HR department or the legal department have heard about this. But they haven't communicated that across the organization. I think a lot of companies would benefit from looking again at how they talk to each other internally at the top, as well as how, as Leslie said, how good they are at hearing from their guys on the ground.
Nick, your experience with clients in trying to get stuff off the net.
Well, there are it comes back to social media guidelines as well, because, there was a magazine in Australia, and the editor of this magazine happened to say at an industry lunch that they always took off bad posts from their chat room. And, the storm of abuse that followed that was really quite significant. So I think, social media guidelines have to be terribly clear who's accountable, who can do that, and the best way forward. But the other point about the fact that stuff lives on the internet is that even though it's incredibly fast, if a social media crisis breaks out, that active listening, when you pick the issue, if you're able to say, you know what, we're just not prepared for this, our current position is insufficient, that's where you can maybe make up some time to get ready so that the right stuff stays on the internet.
I've got you. And Leslie, I've got a question for you here from Erin Burden of Weber Shandwick in New York, so from home. What sort of harm can social media do? How can it be harnessed to good effect? It's the kind of yin and yang of social media, I suppose. Is there a good side to all of this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think social media, we end up talking a lot about the harm it can do to reputation. The point is social media gives companies, CEOs, CCOs, CMOs, whomever, an opportunity to get their statements out, whether they put it on their website, whether they have it on a blog, whether they Twitter it. You get your side of the story out. That's fantastic. You don't have to really go through the traditional way, which used to be go through the traditional media, to get your side of the story or correct the facts. That's an opportunity.
Will the Chief Communications Officer really rise when we've got through this generation? The kind of non-digital generation is on the way upwards and onwards to retirement, I suppose, and there is a new generation that's always been digital. Will they automatically get it?
I think that the CCO will continue to rise because the communications officer is going to be the new content publisher, basically, providing content about the company, its direction, its products, its services. And so they'll be their own production team in a way.
They are also increasingly a factor in managing risk to the company, and that's where I think also the job will be taken more and more seriously.
Rod, can I just ask you a question that's come in from Cristina Valentin in Spain, really asking about what's driven this big rise in awareness in crisis management. I mean, we can all probably think about a couple of stories in the last 12 months, but there's a doubling in awareness of the need for this expertise among senior practitioners. Where's that coming from?
Well, I think to some extent you've answered the question. I think there obviously have been some major issues that clearly have surprised people. I think it is also the case that people worry that they have more audiences and more channels to deal with, and wonder if they are able to manage those appropriately. I think also there's a demand from shareholders, and then looking beyond corporations to the members of organizations and governments, that there's more interest generally in positions and in the dialogue, and more people participating in dialogue, and that inevitably drives more awareness, I think, of risks and of crises when they happen.
Right, and Nick, is this something you're seeing in client work, presumably?
Well, very, very much, and the kind of context has changed because, for example, where a client would leave certain issues to be debated by an industry association, the standing and the reputation of industries are now volatile. In a recent survey, the pharma industry was one of the most trusted, which had not been the case for quite some time.
No,
so, I think that macro context where reputations of whole industries can change overnight, you really have to have your own point of view and your own way of expressing it.
Right, and Leslie, there's some data in this report which shows some differences between readiness here in Europe versus readiness in the States and in Asia. What are the signals we're getting from that?
Well, one of the findings when we're talking about how prepared CCOs felt their companies were for social media threats was that CCOs in the U.S. said that they were more prepared than those in European countries.
Right.
So, and more than in Asia Pacific. So I thought that was interesting, and it wasn't just a small difference; it was pretty significant.
Are they just more self-confident, or they've got on top of it because of the communications culture that exists in that environment? I
think it's the communications culture. It's there's a tremendous interest, coverage, discussion over social media preparedness.
I think if I could add one thing, I think is to an extent there's a false sense of security there because they are very confident, but again, with respect to English language, one thing I dealt with recently had initially happened in another language, and because it was in another language, it didn't get noticed in time by the American corporation. And that I think is where there may be a vulnerability even there.
Nick, you're practicing all over Europe, Middle East, and so on. Do you see a kind of lack of awareness of this?
No, I think it's a kind of a re-education. If you're a comms function in European business, there aren't that many necessarily business titles you need to worry about that speak to your kind of national business community. But we're talking about a threat that could come from anywhere at any time. So I think the more that's understood and the more that's debated, and a bit too, the way it's kind of, made less scary for corporate communications folks, the more they're going to understand the sort of almost universal nature of this threat. And it's very different from saying, there are 15 magazines in Switzerland that make the difference to a corporation and 3 daily newspapers.
What do you see for the future for the CCO, and what should we expect?
Well, we continue to do the survey, and I think what we're going to see is that more CCOs all around the world are going to find that their reputations are being hijacked through social media, and that will be a fact of life. I also think that we'll start to see greater interest in internal communications, as the findings are starting to show, that getting your employees on board, developing them as advocates is going to be job number one. So I think we'll start seeing a lot of that. And I think, as I just recently said, I think that CCOs as content publishers, as content creators for the company is going to rise in importance.
Great. Well, look, just remains for me to thank Rod, Nick and Leslie for their comments today. Thank you all for tuning in. Wish you all a good week. Thanks very much and goodbye.